Welcome to HOA Karma Files. She loved winter rules because they came with fees. I am recording this, and the fine clock starts the second I hit submit. That is what Linda Thomas barked at me, her breath fogging in the single-digit cold, snow pelting both of us as the wind screamed down the narrow corridor between townhomes. She jabbed a gloved finger at the drift piled against my fence, the one the city plow had shoved there an hour earlier when they cleared the street. She said my sidewalk was not passable because of the snowdrift, and she was writing a violation and scheduling a reinspection fee. I held my phone steady, lens aimed at her face, and I said it again. I am recording this, Linda. The fine clock starts the second you hit submit. She did not care. She hit a button on that little portable thermal printer she carried everywhere, and a notice started spitting out with a mechanical whir, curling in the cold. I live in Syracuse, New York, in the Parkside Snow Emergency Corridor Commons Association, a neighborhood where normal life becomes an enforcement opportunity. I work as a home inspector, so I notice every detail, every crooked measurement, every code violation, and every lie. Linda is the treasurer, and she has been weaponizing fees since October, the moment the first freeze hit. The association operates under selective enforcement with escalating daily fines that reset every snowfall, which means if you get tagged once, you are in a loop until spring. I take care of my disabled sibling, who lives with me, and towing or gate harassment would be a crisis. That is what is at stake here. That is why I cannot let this slide. Linda ripped the notice free and shoved it at me. You do not get an opinion, you get a fine schedule. Her catchphrase. She said it at every meeting, every email, every encounter. I took the paper, flipped it over, and read it fast. Violation code, reinspection fee, compliance deadline, daily accrual rate. It was dated today, timed to the minute. I folded it and slid it into my jacket pocket. I said, Linda, the city plow pushed that drift onto my property 30 minutes ago. I cannot clear it until the street crew finishes the block, or I will be shoveling the same snow twice. She smiled, the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes. She said, you have 4 hours to comply or the daily fine starts. Then she turned and walked back toward the clubhouse, boots crunching through the snowpack, that printer swinging from a strap on her shoulder. I stood there, phone still recording, watching her disappear into the whiteout. My driveway was blocked by a plow berm 3 feet high, courtesy of the same city crew. My car was buried. My sibling was inside, safe and warm, but if Linda escalated to towing or gate lockout, we would be stuck. I could not risk that. I hit stop on the recording, saved it to the cloud, and went inside to grab my shovel. 4 hours. That was the window. The problem was, the wind kept piling fresh snow onto every surface I cleared, and the plow came back twice more before noon, shoving new berms across my driveway apron and the public sidewalk. Every time I finished a section, the wind or the plow undid it. By hour 3, I was soaked. My back was screaming, and I still had a quarter of the walk to go. That is when Linda came back, this time with a handheld radio. She keyed the radio and said something I could not make out, then lowered it and looked at me. She said, "You are still not compliant." I gestured at the fresh berm the plow had just left. I said, "Linda, I have been shoveling for 3 hours. The city keeps piling it back." She shrugged. She said, "Not my problem. You have 40 minutes. Then she walked away again, radio crackling with static as someone responded on the other end. I finished the walk 10 minutes before the deadline, every muscle on fire. I took photos, time-stamped, geotagged, showing the cleared path and the fresh drifts already forming at the edges. I sent them to myself, saved them to 3 cloud services, and archived them on an external drive. I wrote down every word, because later I planned to read them back to her. That was my insurance. That was the trump card I was building, one layer at a time, and I was not going to reveal it until the moment it would hurt the most. The next morning, the gate keypad froze. I pulled up to the entrance at 6, heading out for a job site inspection, and the screen was black. I tried my code 3 times. Nothing. I tried the backup code. Nothing. I called the management company emergency line and got voicemail. I called the clubhouse and got voicemail. I sat there, engine running, heat blasting, watching the clock tick closer to my appointment time. Then Linda walked out of the clubhouse, coffee in one hand, radio in the other, and she saw me. She walked over, slow, taking her time. She stopped at my window and tapped on the glass. I rolled it down. She said, "Gate malfunction. Maintenance says it could be all day." I said, "Linda, I have a job. I need to leave." She sipped her coffee. She said, "You do not get an opinion, you get a fine schedule." Then she turned and walked back inside. That was the gate keypad freeze scene where my access failed, and Linda treated it like justice. I sat there for another 5 minutes, rage building, then I backed up, drove around the long way through the emergency exit lane, which triggered an alarm, and left. Linda filed a violation notice for unauthorized exit before I even got to the job site. The email was waiting when I checked my phone at the first red light. That night, I reached out to my ally. Her name is Monica, a renter advocate who knows how to file complaints and navigate housing bureaucracy. She lives 3 streets over, rents a townhome, and has been dealing with the association longer than I have. I called her, explained the situation, and she said, "You need to come to the next board meeting." I said, "They are not listening." She said, "They will if you bring a petition." I said, "What petition?" She said, "The one we are going to file tomorrow. I will help you draft it. Bring your evidence." We met at a coffee shop the next afternoon. Monica brought a tablet, pulled up the association bylaws, and started highlighting sections. She said, "Linda is violating procedure in 3 places. First, reinspection fees require board approval every time, not blanket authorization. Second, selective enforcement is a fair housing risk if you can prove disparate impact. Third, daily fines that reset with every snowfall are not in the governing documents." I said, "So what do we do?" She said, "We file a formal complaint with the management company, copy the board, and we get 10 homeowners to sign a petition demanding a vote on enforcement standards. If we can force a vote during the meeting, Linda has to defend her decisions on the record." I said, "Can you get 10 signatures?" She said, "I already have 6. You make 7. I know 3 more who are fed up. We start knocking on doors tonight." We did. By the end of the week, we had 12 signatures, and Monica filed the petition with the management company, CC'd the entire board, and scheduled it for the February meeting. Linda did not respond, but the board secretary did. He said the petition was received and would be added to the agenda under new business. Then, Linda escalated. She sent an email blast to the entire neighborhood, framing me as the one resident who refuses winter safety. The subject line said "Compliance Update," and the body was 3 paragraphs of selective facts, twisted timelines, and a photo of my driveway taken at the worst possible moment, right after the plow had come through and before I had a chance to clear it. She did not name me directly, but she included my street and unit number. My phone started buzzing within minutes. Neighbors I barely knew were texting me, some supportive, some hostile. One guy said I was making the neighborhood look bad. Another said Linda was out of control, and he was glad someone was pushing back. The messages kept coming all night. The next day, I got a call from the towing company. The dispatcher said they had received a request to tow my vehicle for overnight parking violation. I said, "I park in my assigned spot every night." He said, "The request says you are parked in a fire lane." I said, "That is a lie." He said, "I am just letting you know. If you move it now, we will not come." I went outside. My car was in my spot, exactly where it belonged, well within the lines. I took photos, called the towing company back, and told them if they showed up, I would file a complaint with the city. The dispatcher said, "Understood," and hung up. That was the second tow attempt, and I put them on notice to stop. But it did not stop. A neighbor I thought was neutral, a guy named Greg who lived 2 doors down, started showing up every time I shoveled. He would stand on his porch, arms crossed, watching. Then he would pull out his phone and take photos. I ignored him for a week, but then Monica told me Greg was sending those photos to Linda, unpaid, just because he liked being part of the enforcement. That was the side complication, and it made everything harder. I could not shovel without being surveilled, and every photo Greg took became another potential violation notice. If you are enjoying this story, smash that like button and subscribe for more HOA horror stories where the little guy wins. February came and the board meeting was scheduled. Monica told me to bring everything: the recordings, the photos, the timeline, the notices. She said, do not give them the full picture yet. Let Linda talk first. Let her commit to her version of events on the record. Then you respond. I said, what if she does not talk? Monica said, she will. She always does. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, a cramped room with folding chairs and bad acoustics. 20 residents showed up, more than usual. Linda sat at the front table with the board president and the secretary. She had a stack of papers in front of her and that portable thermal printer on the table, like a warning. The board president called the meeting to order, ran through the usual agenda items, and then hit new business. Monica stood up and introduced the petition. She said, we have 12 signatures requesting a vote on enforcement standards and timelines. Specifically, we are asking the board to establish clear written procedures for snow violations, reinspection fees, and daily fine accruals, and to publish those standards to all homeowners. Linda did not wait for the president to respond. She said, we already have standards. They are called the rules. If people followed them, we would not need to have this conversation. Monica said, the rules do not specify reinspection fees or daily accrual resets. Linda said, they do not need to. The board has discretion. Monica said, discretion requires consistency. Selective enforcement is a liability. Linda slammed her hand on the table. She said, I will bury you in notices until you run out of printer ink. The room went silent. A few people gasped. One guy laughed, then stopped. Monica sat down. She looked at me and nodded. I stood up. I said, Linda, you just threatened a resident on the record in a board meeting. That is not discretion. That is harassment. Linda said, you are out of order. I said, no, I am not. I have the floor. The board president looked uncomfortable. He said, let him speak. I said, I have been documenting every interaction with Linda since October. I have recordings, timestamped photos, and copies of every notice she has issued. I also have evidence that the procedures she is using are not authorized by the governing documents, and I have evidence that her enforcement is selective and retaliatory. The room was dead quiet now. Linda leaned forward. She said, you do not get an opinion, you get a fine schedule. That was the third time she said it, and this time it landed wrong. A woman in the back row said, Jesus, Linda. Another guy said, that is messed up. I said, I also have a bank confirmation showing my payments cleared, and the HOA marked them late anyway. That is the trump card I am deploying right now. I pulled out the printed bank statement, walked up to the front table, and placed it in front of the board secretary. I said, I submitted as a formal exhibit at the hearing and watched Linda's face change. Her expression shifted from smug confidence to something closer to panic. The secretary picked up the statement, read it, and looked at Linda. He said, Linda, this shows the payment posted on the 15th. You marked it late on the 17th. Linda said, that is a processing delay. The secretary said, we do not charge late fees for processing delays. Linda said, I will need to review my records. The secretary said, please do. And while you are at it, pull the records for every late fee you have assessed in the last 6 months. Monica stood up again. She said, I would also like to request an audit of the reinspection fee process. The board president rubbed his face. He said, fine. We will schedule an audit. Is there anything else? I said, yes. I want to know if the board votes that authorized Linda's enforcement actions were conducted with a quorum. The board president looked at the secretary. The secretary flipped through a notebook. He said, I will need to verify that. I said, please do. Because if those votes happened without a quorum, the entire enforcement wave is invalid. The room erupted. People were talking over each other. The board president banged a gavel, which I did not even know we had. He said, we will recess for 15 minutes while we review the records. Linda stood up and walked out of the room, the thermal printer still on the table. I watched her go. Monica leaned over and whispered, you just broke her. I said, not yet. The recess stretched to 30 minutes. When the board came back, the secretary looked grim. He said, "I have reviewed the minutes for the last 6 months. 3 votes related to enforcement policy were conducted without a quorum. Per the bylaws, those votes are void." The room exploded again. The board president banged the gavel twice. He said, "We will need to re-vote on those items at the next meeting, and we will need to notify all homeowners of the voided actions. In the meantime, any enforcement actions taken under those voided votes are suspended pending review." Linda walked back into the room just in time to hear that. Her face went red. She said, "You cannot do that." The board president said, "We already did." Linda said, "I am the treasurer. I have authority." The board president said, "You have the authority the board grants you, and right now we are reviewing that grant." Linda looked at me, then at Monica, then back at the board. She said, "This is ridiculous." A neighbor in the third row said, "No." Linda, "What is ridiculous is threatening residents with printer ink." The room laughed. Linda grabbed her papers and her printer and walked out. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. The board voted to suspend all pending reinspection fees and daily fines pending the audit, and they voted to draft clear enforcement standards and timelines to be distributed to all homeowners within 30 days. That was the HOA consequence. The HOA must publish standards and timelines to all homeowners. Monica and I left together. She said, "That went better than I expected." I said, "It is not over yet." She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Linda is going to retaliate. She always does." Monica said, "Let her. You have her on record now." I was right. 2 days later, I got a notice taped to my door. It was not from Linda. It was from the management company. It said my account was under review for collections language, and I had 10 days to respond or they would proceed with lien filing. That was the time pressure, and it forced fast decisions. I called the management company immediately. I spoke to a supervisor, explained the situation, and forwarded her the bank statement and the board meeting audio. She said, "I will need to investigate this." I said, "Please do it fast. If this hits my credit, I will have a problem." She said, "I understand. I will call you back within 48 hours. She called back the next day. She said, "I have reviewed your account and the meeting audio. The collections notice was issued in error. Your account is current. I have removed the notice and flagged Linda's access to the accounts payable system for supervisor review." I said, "Thank you." She said, "I also want to let you know that the board has requested a formal review of Linda's role as treasurer. That review will be completed before the next meeting." I said, "Good." She said, "If you have any further issues, contact me directly. Do not go through Linda." I said, "Understood." The next board meeting was in March. The weather had warmed slightly, but snow was still everywhere, compacted and filthy. I showed up early. Monica was already there. She said, "The board is going to address Linda tonight." I said, "How do you know?" She said, "The board president called me yesterday. He wanted to make sure we were here." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because they are going to ask Linda to step down. If she refuses, they are going to vote to remove her." I said, "Good." Linda arrived late. She walked in with her printer, her radio, and a stack of new notices. She sat down at the front table, but the board president did not acknowledge her. He called the meeting to order, ran through the agenda, and then stopped. He said, "Before we proceed to new business, the board needs to address a personnel matter. Linda, we need to discuss your role as treasurer." Linda said, "What about it?" He said, "The management company has completed a review of your account activity and your enforcement actions over the last 6 months. They have identified multiple procedural violations, including unauthorized late fees, improper use of reinspection charges, and retaliatory communications with homeowners." Linda said, "That is not true." He said, "It is documented. We have the emails, the meeting audio, and the complaint logs." Linda said, "I was doing my job." He said, "Your job is to manage finances, not to harass residents." The board president continued. He said, "The board has voted, with a quorum, to censure you in public, strip your committee powers, and ban you from contacting homeowners outside official meetings. That was the Karen consequence. Karen is forced to apologize on the record in front of the room. Linda said, "You cannot do that." He said, "We already did. The vote was 5-0. You were recused." Linda stood up. She said, "I am not apologizing." The board president said, "Then you leave us no choice. We are removing you as treasurer effective immediately. The board secretary will assume your duties until we appoint a replacement." Linda said, "This is illegal." The board president said, "No, Linda. What you did was illegal. What we are doing is correcting it." Linda grabbed her things and walked out. The thermal printer fell off the table on her way out, hit the floor, and cracked open. Papers spilled everywhere. A neighbor in the front row said, "Oops." The room laughed. The board president waited until Linda was gone, then looked at me. He said, "I want to apologize on behalf of the board for what you went through. We should have caught this sooner." I nodded. Monica said, "What about the voided votes?" The board president said, "We revoted on all 3 items last week with a proper quorum. The enforcement standards are being drafted now, and they will be distributed to all homeowners by the end of the month." Monica said, "Good." He said, "If anyone else has issues with selective enforcement, please bring them to the board or the management company. This stops now." The showdown happened 2 weeks later, at the plow berm at the end of my driveway where Karen tries to direct traffic like she is a cop. Linda showed up one morning while I was clearing a fresh snowfall. She parked her car across the street, got out, and walked over. She did not have the printer this time. She said, "You think you won." I kept shoveling. She said, "You ruined my reputation." I stopped, looked at her, and said, "No, Linda, you did that yourself." She said, "I was following the rules." I said, "You were making up the rules as you went, and you got caught." She said, "I will fight this." I said, "Good luck." Then I went back to shoveling. She stood there for another minute, then got in her car and left. I have not seen her since. The association published the new enforcement standards in April. They were clear, reasonable, and applied equally to everyone. Reinspection fees required board approval every time. Daily fines could not reset with every snowfall. Selective enforcement complaints would be reviewed by an independent third party. Monica and I both signed off on the new standards at the next meeting. The board thanked us for our patience and our advocacy. I still live in Parkside Snow Emergency Corridor Commons Association. I still take care of my sibling. The neighborhood is quieter now. Greg stopped surveilling me. The towing company never came back. The gate keypad got fixed, and now it works every time. Linda moved out in June. I heard she bought a condo in a building with no HOA. I hope she is happier there. I know I am happier here. Looking back, the whole thing was absurd. A thermal printer, a handheld radio, a voided quorum, and a bank statement. That is all it took to flip the script. But the lesson is simple. Document everything. Know your rights. Find your allies. And never let someone bully you just because they have a title and a stack of notices. The system works when you make it work. Keep your sanity, and I will catch you next time.